What do you mean the colony's already gone? High Marshal Urvok's mandibles twitched in disbelief as the sensor officer's voice crackled through the bridge's comms. The warship Orvathkul drifted in the shadow of a dead moon, its massive silhouette blotting out the pale glow of distant starlight. The Dominion fleet had arrived expecting a feeble human resistance, a few desperate patrol boats scrambling in futility. Instead, they had found nothing but silence. There should be wreckage, bodies, something, Urvok snapped, pacing toward the forward viewports. His heavy footsteps sent tremors through the polished deck plates. No species abandons a colony without a fight. Humans aren't that fast. The sensor officer hesitated before responding. Marshal, there are no life signs, no power readings, not even residual heat from an evacuation. Urvok's gut twisted. The humans weren't just gone. It was as if the colony had never existed. Then, the void spoke back. A sharp proximity alert flared across every heads-up display on the bridge, bathing the room in red luminescence. Officers scrambled to their stations as the sensor feeds flickered, resolving into a single, massive gravitational displacement directly behind the fleet. Something had arrived. A heartbeat later, the first ship revealed itself, not by decloaking, not by breaking warp, but by emerging, black as an obsidian tide, from the darkness between stars. No engine trails, no thermal signatures, just a vast matte construct that swallowed the meager light of the system's dying sun. And it wasn't alone. One by one, they bloomed into existence, silent behemoths larger than any Dominion dreadnought, their hulls devoid of markings, their presence a quiet herald of annihilation. Urvok took a step back from the viewport, mandibles slack. Impossible! The silence shattered. A beam of searing white light erupted from the lead black ship, not streaking toward them like conventional weaponry, but cutting through space in an instant. The Dominion warship Kethlon disintegrated mid-scream, its hull shearing in half as atmosphere and bodies vented into the void. "Return fire!" Urvok roared. Missiles streaked out, plasma batteries thundered. But the black ships didn't dodge. They didn't counter-fire. They simply let the weapons impact. The Dominion fleet's most advanced warheads detonated against invisible shielding, their explosions rippling harmlessly across unseen barriers before fading into irrelevance. Urvok's mind raced. These weren't the sluggish, outdated warships intelligence reports had described. The humans hadn't just hidden their power. They had baited the Dominion into attacking the wrong target. This wasn't a war. It was a trap. And they had walked right into it. The reinforced chamber beneath Europa's frozen surface was deathly quiet, save for the rhythmic click-click-click of Renault Varros drumming his fingers against the armrest of his chair. The Supreme Executor of Earth's hidden fleet watched the live feed through a sprawling laser plasma display, his expression carved from stone. He had waited decades for this moment. Across the command center, high-ranking officers stood in tense silence, their eyes fixed on the unfolding battle. Some clenched fists. Others barely breathed. Then, without turning his head, Renault spoke. "Admiral Solmir." A figure stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered, draped in the sharp black uniform of Earth's Shadow Fleet. Admiral Dane Solmir, commander of the Silent Armada, folded his hands behind his back. "Sir, proceed." The single word was an execution order. Urvok barely had time to process the cold, sinking dread in his chest before the real assault began. The black ships moved, not like Dominion warships, which relied on calculated formations and coordinated firing arcs, not like pirates, who danced in erratic patterns. The Silent Armada surged forward in perfect, unbroken unity, an organism of war, each ship shifting as if following some unspoken rhythm. The Dominion fleet had no such harmony. A second black ship fired, unleashing a shockwave of kinetic force that ripped through the line of Dominion vessels. Frigates spun wildly, their hulls bending inward before shattering apart. They're inside our formation," a lieutenant screeched over the bridge comms. Urvok bared his fangs. "They're not inside it. They built it around us." Then the black ships began deploying their ground forces. Atmospheric drop pods, sleek and needle-thin, broke off from the silent behemoths, plunging toward the Dominion-occupied colony below. And Urvok knew. He knew what kind of warriors were coming. They weren't machines. They weren't drones. They were humans. The inside of the drop pod rattled violently as it tore through the atmosphere, metal creaking from the sheer force of entry. Ren Voska barely noticed. His gloved fingers adjusted the clamps on his wrist guards, tightening them into place. Around him a dozen Earthborn super soldiers sat in grim silence, their faces shadowed beneath darkened visors. The comms crackled with a single directive. Leave none standing. The pod hit the surface like a god's hammer. Metal sheared, stone cracked. Dominion infantry barely had time to turn before the doors blew open and humanity's war demons stormed into their midst. Ren moved first. His boots hit soil, and he was already raising his rifle, putting 2 rounds into the skull of the nearest Varesh soldier before they could scream. His men followed suit. Gunfire shredded the air. Dominion warriors, tall, proud, battle-hardened, died like cattle. Their thick plated armor, so effective against conventional weapons, folded like paper beneath human firepower. One Varesh commander tried to rally. His throat was crushed before the words left his mouth, Ren's gauntlet tightening with the strength of a steel vise. "You were warned," Ren whispered as he wrenched the alien's body forward, a knife sliding between his ribs. Screams echoed, fire rose. Within minutes the Dominion's defensive line collapsed, and as Ren stood among the smoldering remains of their command post, he let out a slow breath, watching the plasma glow of the black ships overhead. "They thought we were sleeping," he muttered. Then he smiled. They were wrong. Above the battlefield, aboard the command ship, Renault Varros watched the Dominion's forces unravel. He did not celebrate. He was already preparing for what came next. The air still carried the taste of metal and burnt flesh. Ren Voska rolled his shoulders, feeling the faint pop of stiff joints beneath his armor. The battle had lasted minutes, no seconds. The Dominion had fallen faster than anyone had expected. But he wasn't foolish enough to think this was over. This was only the beginning. "Captain, we've secured the central command post. The survivors are scattering," Sergeant Voss reported, his voice steady. But his stance betrayed something else, unease. Ren exhaled sharply, stepping over the twitching body of a Dominion officer. The alien's once pristine uniform was torn, his chest cavity split open where a kinetic round had punched through it. Blood, dark and viscous, had already begun to pool beneath him. "Don't let them scatter too far," Ren muttered, scanning the ruined cityscape. "We're not done sending a message." The Dominion had built this colony into a fortress. Defensive walls, automated turrets, barracks stacked high enough to block out the sky. And now the walls were caved in. Their own cannons lay silent, and the barracks were filled with nothing but the dead. "Orders from command?" Voss pressed, shifting uncomfortably. Ren turned his gaze skyward. The black ships still loomed, silent and unshaken. The sheer enormity of them made his gut twist in ways he refused to acknowledge. Those ships were more than war machines. They were monuments of a truth the galaxy had ignored for too long. "We hold." Ren tightened the grip on his rifle. "Let them feel this weight pressing down on them. Let them understand." Voss didn't question it. The men followed orders, moving through the rubble like shadows, clearing out pockets of resistance without wasting breath. The silence was worse than the battle. Dominion soldiers weren't screaming anymore. No one called for mercy, because mercy wasn't coming. Urvok's hands trembled as he reached for the command console. His claws scraped against the controls, leaving shallow gouges in the metal. The bridge of the Orvathkul was a mess. Officers shouted over each other. Reports flooded the displays. But all he could hear was the slow, deliberate beep of the casualty counter rising. "Marshal," one of his aides began, voice tight with panic. "The fleet is—" "I can see it," Urvok snapped, mandibles clicking together in frustration. He could see it. He could see everything. His warships, his fleet, being systematically carved apart, not in a chaotic battle, not in the glorious struggle the Dominion's doctrines had promised. This was execution. The black ships didn't chase stragglers. They didn't fire wildly into the fray. They moved with purpose, breaking formations with elegant lethality, severing supply lines before their ships could even maneuver. His officers had no answer. "We need to retreat," one of his commanders said, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. "We do not retreat," Urvok roared, slamming a fist against the console. Retreat was weakness. Retreat was failure. The Dominion did not retreat, but as he stared at the laser plasma display, watching another cruiser fold in on itself from the force of a direct impact, he felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't rage, it was realization. "Open a channel," he ordered, his voice quieter now. The comms officer hesitated but complied. A moment later, the display flickered, and a new image resolved into view. The human, the one they had been told did not exist, Renault Varros, Supreme Executor of Earth's hidden fleet. He was seated, the high collar of his dark uniform casting a sharp line across his throat. His expression was unreadable, cold, detached, as if he were merely observing something from a great distance. "Marshal Urvok." Urvok's mandibles twitched. Renault's voice was measured, not mocking, not arrogant, just there. As if all of this had already played out in his mind before it even began. "You—" Urvok inhaled sharply, steadying himself. "You must understand, this attack, this war, we were given orders. The Regent—" "I don't care." The words cut through him like a vibroblade. "Your fleet is dying," Renault continued, his voice never rising, never falling. "Your colonies are crumbling. You will not be remembered as a warrior. You will be remembered as the fool who mistook silence for weakness." Urvok's throat tightened. "We can negotiate." The Dominion— No, a single word, flat, absolute. The bridge fell silent. Urvok felt the weight of it, the finality. "You had your war." Renault leaned forward slightly, and for the first time his eyes seemed to see him. "Now you will learn its cost." The transmission cut. Urvok's knees nearly buckled. Then the black ships moved again. The display faded, the bridge of the Dominion's flagship vanishing from sight. Renault leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The room was still. Every officer present had watched that exchange, and though none spoke, he could feel their thoughts pressing against him. Admiral Dane Solmir broke the silence first. "What now?" Renault's fingers tapped against the armrest again. "Now," he murmured, "we make sure they understand." Solmir nodded, turning to the secondary officers. "Begin Phase 2. Across the battlefield, the real war began. Humanity had not come just to destroy the Dominion. They had come to unmake it, and no one would stop them. The Dominion fleets were dying wrong. Renault Varros had seen enough wars to know what a proper military collapse looked like. Disorder, desertion, desperate last stands that meant nothing in the face of inevitability. But this was structured failure, as if some unseen hand had arranged the downfall before the first shot had ever been fired. He didn't like it. Standing in the command chamber beneath Europa's frozen crust, he watched the war unfold on the laser plasma displays, his eyes scanning for a pattern. Planets surrendered before ground forces could even breach their atmospheres. Governors took their own lives before negotiations could begin. Entire Dominion fleets self-destructed rather than be captured. "Something is wrong," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Admiral Dane Solmir folded his arms behind his back. "They know they're beaten. This is just the last throes of a dying empire." Renault shook his head. Number. This wasn't the end of a government. This was an orchestrated erasure. Before he could respond, a proximity alert flared across the main display. A Dominion battleship, the Karin Val, had broken from its formation, its trajectory aimed at one of the Silent Armada's outer flanks. It wasn't a suicide run. The weapons were powered down, shields offline. A surrender then. "Put them through," Renault ordered. The screen resolved into the bridge of the enemy warship. A Dominion officer stood at attention, rigid, his mandibles barely twitching despite the weight pressing down on him. His golden command armor was scorched, dented from whatever fight had taken place before this battle even began. "I am Sub-Warlord Karaveth," the officer said, his voice measured, careful. and I have come to trade my life for the truth." Renault's gaze narrowed. A confession? A warning? Carveth exhaled sharply, a Dominion gesture that usually preceded either a formal statement or an execution. "The Dominion never wanted this war," he said, the words slow, deliberate. "We were guided into it, pushed." Renault's fingers tapped against his armrest. "Here it is. The missing thread." "Who?" Carveth hesitated, his mandibles clicking in unease. "I do not know their name. No one does. We received encrypted orders, hidden in official communications, altering our military directives over decades. They planted the belief that humanity was weak, an easy conquest. They fed the Grand Region intelligence that never matched reality, yet always seemed credible enough to act upon. By the time we understood the manipulation, it was too late. The Dominion does not retreat." Renault exhaled slowly. The pieces fit too well. Something had been moving them toward this war, some unseen force that understood how to nudge an empire into ruin. "And your Grand Regent?" Renault asked. Carveth's jaw tightened. "Dead." Renault leaned forward. "How?" "A message reached his chambers minutes before your invasion began. He read it and then shot himself. We do not know what it said." A chill threaded down Renault's spine. He had expected defiance, anger, last stands born of arrogance. But this wasn't the behavior of a broken military. This was the response of a species realizing too late that it had been a pawn. Renault stared at the display, searching Carveth's eyes for any sign of deception. He found none. "What do you want, sub-warlord?" Carveth stood taller. "My people are finished. The Dominion will not survive this. But if you wish to know who truly started this war, let me live. Allow me to show you what was left behind." The bridge fell into silence. Solmir shifted beside him. "It's a trick." "Perhaps." Renault studied the Dominion officer for another beat, before turning toward his men. "Bring him in." The once mighty seat of the Dominion was silent, not in the way of a conquered world, not in the way of a battlefield long abandoned. It was emptied, as though something had walked through its grand halls and stripped it of everything that made it real. Renault walked across the marble floors of the Grand Regent's palace, his boots the only sound in the cavernous chamber. Once, this place had housed rulers, warlords, the architects of interstellar conquest. Now it felt wrong, like an abandoned set piece in a forgotten play. Carveth walked beside him, his posture rigid, his gaze forward. "We didn't understand," the Dominion officer murmured. "We thought we were in control." Renault's gaze flicked toward the far end of the chamber where a single terminal still flickered. He strode toward it, gesturing to his technicians. "Decrypt it." A few keystrokes, a flare of blue across the laser plasma display. Then suddenly, the message appeared. Renault read it. His blood ran cold. It wasn't Dominion script, it wasn't human, it wasn't any known language in the galactic records. It was something else, something older. Renault's lips parted slightly as he stared at the final line, the only one translated automatically. "The test is complete. The observer is satisfied." A silence settled over the chamber, heavy as stone. "What does it mean?" Carveth asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Renault's jaw tightened. The war wasn't a war. It was a measurement, a provocation. Someone had wanted to see what humanity was capable of. And now they knew. Renault turned away from the screen, his expression unreadable. "It means we were never at war with the Dominion." Carveth's mandibles twitched. "Then who?" Renault exhaled slowly. "Someone who thinks they're watching us from a safe distance." Carveth blinked. "Are they?" Renault's gaze lifted toward the void beyond the shattered skylight. "No." Deep in the blackest corners of the galaxy, unseen and untouched, something stirred. And for the first time in a long, long while, it was watching back. Renault Varros stood at the edge of the shattered skylight, the Dominion capital sprawling beneath him, silent as a graveyard. The wind carried the distant murmur of broken cities, metal groaning, fires crackling, the dull thuds of collapsed spires crumbling under their own weight. The Dominion had ruled for centuries, but its empire had unraveled in days. He had not come here to celebrate a victory. He had come to see the corpse of an illusion. The test is complete. The observer is satisfied. The words gnawed at him. He could feel them settling deep, curling around the edges of his thoughts like vines creeping into the foundation of a rotting house. Something had been watching, and they had let this war happen. He exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air as he turned toward the laser plasma display, affixed to his wrist. Data scrolled rapidly. Encrypted Dominion transmissions, emergency distress signals still flickering in the void, silent requests for aid that had never been answered. "Sir?" Admiral Dane Solmier's voice carried none of its usual dry amusement. It was clipped, tense. He had seen the message too. Renault turned, watching as Solmier stepped forward, his gaze flicking once toward the terminal that still displayed the translated words. "It wasn't them," Renault said before the Admiral could speak. "The Dominion thought they were in control, but they were being steered." Solmier's jaw tightened. "By what?" Renault glanced back down at the city. "That's what we're going to find out." Carveth, the surviving Dominion officer, shifted beside them. The alien had been silent since reading the message, his mandibles twitching in thought. "You said you received orders over decades," Renault said, directing his attention to the warlord. "From where?" Carveth exhaled sharply. "The transmissions came through encrypted Dominion channels. Official. We never questioned them." "Then you were given coordinates, instructions." Renault's gaze sharpened. "Did you ever ask where those orders originated?" Carveth hesitated. "No." Renault studied him, then turned his attention to the laser plasma display again. "Then we will." The bridge of the Erebus was dark, lit only by the glow of the star map hovering above the central war table. The air carried the sterile chill of deep space operations, filtered, processed, devoid of anything organic. Renault stood at the center, staring at the pulsating set of coordinates extracted from the Dominion's transmissions. It led nowhere. A dead system. No official records. No known history of settlements. But someone had been sending messages from there. Solmier leaned forward, his expression grim. "A trap." Renault nodded slightly. "Undoubtedly. But it's the only lead we have." Silence settled over the bridge. No one wanted to be the first to say it. That this war had been nothing more than a carefully staged performance. That the Dominion, for all its arrogance, had not been the true enemy. That humanity had never been the target. They had been the bait. "We move at dawn cycle," Renault finally said. "Prepare a strike team. I want minimal fleet presence. If this is a lure, we don't show our full hand." Solmier hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. Renault turned away from the table, his gaze lingering on the floating coordinates. Someone had wanted humanity to reveal its strength. He intended to find out why. The planet hung in the void like a wound. The surface was scarred, blackened by something unnatural. Not fire, not war. Something deeper. A sterile destruction, as if every living thing had been surgically removed, leaving only the skeletal remains of a world long forgotten. Renault stood in the dropship's loading bay, armored, visor down, rifle maglock to his side. His boots were planted firmly against the steel plating, his stance unwavering. Across from him, his men stood in silence. Hand-picked operatives, veterans of a war that had never been about conquering but proving a point. Carveth was the only Dominion soldier among them. He had requested to come. Renault had allowed it. If nothing else, he wanted to see the fear in the aliens' eyes when they finally uncovered what had been manipulating his people. "Final approach," the pilot called over the comms. The ship trembled slightly as it cut through the thin atmosphere. Below, the terrain was jagged, unnatural, littered with structures too symmetrical to be ruins, yet too lifeless to be inhabited. "We're not alone," Solmier's voice crackled in through Renault's earpiece. "There's movement below, not Dominion." Renault's grip on his weapon tightened. "Then let's introduce ourselves." The ship landed, the ramp dropped, and Renault stepped into a graveyard of ghosts. The structures loomed around them, silent monoliths of a civilization that had never been recorded. They weren't ruins, not in the traditional sense. No crumbling walls, no signs of decay, just emptiness. Carveth walked beside Renault, his mandibles twitching in discomfort. "This place was never ours," the alien muttered. "But I have seen it before." Renault's gaze flicked toward him. "Where?" Carveth hesitated. "In fragments, in flashes, when the Grand Regent was given his final orders." He exhaled sharply, scanning the structures with wary eyes. "I thought they were dreams." A sudden movement in the distance caught Renault's attention. A figure, not Dominion, not human, something else. He raised a fist, signaling his men to stop. The team dropped into a defensive formation, weapons trained, breaths held. The figure did not approach. It simply watched. "Identify yourself," Renault called out. No response. The figure remained still, and then it turned and walked into the ruins. "Follow it," Renault ordered. They moved forward, slow, methodical. The structures around them grew denser, taller, as if guiding them toward something hidden. The weight of the silence pressed against them, thick as fog. Then, as they rounded a final corner, a chamber awaited them. Inside, lined in perfect, unnatural symmetry, were tombs, not of the Dominion, not of humanity. Something else, something older. Renault stepped closer, brushing dust from the nearest slab. Beneath the grime, a single engraving glowed to life, its language shifting, morphing, rearranging itself into something he could understand. His breath stilled. The words were not a warning. They were a statement. "Welcome to the first extinction." Renault's grip on his rifle tightened. Behind him, Carveth whispered, voice tight with dread, "We were never the first." And deep within the hollow city, something awakened. The air inside the chamber felt wrong, not stale, not lifeless, but suspended, as if sound itself was held captive between the walls. Dust spiraled in slow, weightless drifts, catching in the dull glow of their helmet lights. The tombs stretched out before them, their surfaces eerily smooth, untouched by time or decay. Renault Varros traced his gloved fingertips along the engraving on the nearest slab, his mind racing. Welcome to the first extinction. A statement, a declaration, not a warning. Behind him, Carveth shifted uneasily, mandibles clicking as he whispered, "We were never the first." Renault exhaled slowly. No, they weren't. He turned to Solmir, whose sharp eyes scanned the tombs, his hand resting near his sidearm. He wasn't afraid. He was waiting. "Scan them," Renault ordered. One of the operatives stepped forward, activating the deep field analysis suite built into his wrist display. A soft hum, not from the device, but from somewhere beneath them, began to resonate. The tombs reacted. Thin lines of white light pulsed along the engravings, flowing like liquid through the inscriptions, illuminating the chamber as if something had been listening all along. The operative stumbled back. "They're not just graves." His voice was tight. "They're locks." Something clicked. Not a mechanical sound. Something deeper. A shift in the fabric of the space itself. The walls, smooth and unbroken just moments ago, rippled, reshaping into pathways that had not existed before. The ground beneath them vibrated, slow and deliberate, like the distant stirring of a beast exhaling in its sleep. Carveth took a step back, his claws flexing. "We need to leave." Renault ignored him, moving toward the newly revealed passage. "Not yet." He had to see. The corridor stretched downward, the walls lined with inscriptions that moved like static on a broken display. The team advanced cautiously, rifles raised, boots making dull thuds against the smooth floor. As they walked, the symbols shifted again, this time forming something familiar, Earth's languages. The sentence repeated itself over and over. "We have seen you before." Solmir's voice was quiet, but edged. "What the hell does that mean?" No one answered. The passage finally ended at a doorway. No visible mechanism, no interface. just a smooth surface, waiting. Renault reached out. The moment his fingers brushed the stone, it split apart, not shattering, not sliding, but unraveling like the petals of a flower peeling away. Beyond it, the truth lay waiting. It was not a room. It was a mausoleum of knowledge. Rows of massive data vaults, etched in alien script, lined the walls. Floating above them, flickering and fragmented, were images, scenes from countless wars, countless civilizations. Some Renault recognized, some had been wiped from history. And there, at the very center of it all, was a single, pulsing construct, a sphere. A device, no larger than a human's chest, beating like a heart. Renault stepped forward, scanning it carefully. "Can we access it?" Solmir asked. One of the tech specialists was already moving, pulling out a portable link interface. "I can try, but whatever this is, it's old, beyond anything we've encountered." Renault's fingers twitched at his side. He had a choice. They had won the war against the Dominion, but that war had never been the real war. "Do it." The tech operative connected the interface. The chamber reacted. A wave of energy rippled outward, racing along the walls, igniting the inscriptions with a deep, pulsing glow. And then, it spoke. It wasn't a voice in the conventional sense. It bypassed language entirely, slamming into the mind like a memory long forgotten. Renault staggered slightly, gripping his temple as the weight of the words pressed into him. "You were meant to remain hidden." The images shifted. Humanity. Not as it was now, but long before. Prehistory. A time when they had not yet reached beyond their own skies. You were spared once. Another shift. This time, it was Earth. But not Earth as they knew it. A different Earth. One that had burned before. Renault's throat tightened. "Who are you?" The voice carried no emotion. "The observer." The images flared again. The Dominion, the wars, the pieces of history they had assumed were isolated events. They were not. They had been tests. Every war, every conflict, every shattered empire. An experiment, to see who would rise, and now humanity had been marked. "You have revealed yourselves." Renault's pulse pounded in his ears. "And now, others will come." The light snapped out. The chamber went still, and deep in the hollow city something shifted in the dark. The first tremor was almost imperceptible, a low vibration running beneath their boots, more felt than heard. Then the walls began to break. "Move!" Renault barked. The team sprinted back up the passage, the vault behind them collapsing in on itself, sealing the truth away once more. The symbols on the walls flickered violently, their meanings unraveling as they ran. As they reached the surface, the skies darkened, not with ships, not with storms, but with something unseen, something just beyond the threshold of perception, pressing down upon the world like an unspoken verdict. Renault turned his gaze upward. He could feel them now, watching, waiting, testing. Carveth, breathless, stared at the sky. "What have we done?" Renault didn't answer, because in the depths of his mind he already knew. The real war had never been between humanity and the Dominion. The real war had never even started. And whoever had been watching, they weren't waiting anymore. The sky over Zaranth IV felt heavier than it had moments ago. Renault Varros stood at the edge of the hollow city's ruins, his eyes locked onto the oppressive blackness stretching beyond the upper atmosphere. It wasn't a fleet. It wasn't a storm. It was something else, something that had been watching. The air carried a stillness that felt wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Renault's team had regrouped near the dropships, their movements sharp, disciplined, but there was no mistaking the shift in their demeanor. They had fought in wars, seen planetary glassings, watched Dominion legions fall in fire and steel. But they had never encountered anything like this. "Status on our fleet?" Renault asked, his voice level. Admiral Solmir tapped his wrist display. The laser plasma interface flared to life, cycling through encrypted signals. It was slower than it should have been. "Interference," Solmir muttered. Some kind of dampening field. Our ships are seeing this too, but they're not reading any gravitational anomalies or heat signatures. Renault exhaled, calculating. That meant this wasn't a standard cloaking field. It wasn't hiding. It simply existed beyond what their instruments could define. Carveth stood beside them, staring at the sky with an expression Renault had never seen on a Dominion officer before. Not fear, recognition. "You've seen this before," Renault said. It wasn't a question. The Dominion officer's mandibles twitched. Not like this. But in records, yes. In whispers. His voice was low, careful. "We called it the Hollow Veil, a presence that never left a trace. Our ancestors feared it, but over time we forgot. Or maybe we chose to." Renault considered that. The Dominion had been nudged into this war, prodded along like cattle into the slaughterhouse. But now the real butcher had stepped into the light. "We need to leave," Solmir said, gaze still locked on the blackness above. "If they wanted to strike, they would have. But they're waiting for something." Renault nodded. He didn't like retreating, but this wasn't a battlefield yet. And he refused to fight blind. "Back to the fleet," he ordered. "Now." The dropships carved through Zaranth IV's atmosphere, breaking into the cold clarity of open space. Renault stood near the viewport, watching the world shrink beneath them. The hollow city, the tombs, the whispers left in stone, they had been breadcrumbs leading to this moment. The bridge of the Erebus was tense when they arrived. Officers moved with quiet efficiency, scanning every wavelength, analyzing patterns that refused to settle into anything recognizable. The black ships, the backbone of the Silent Armada, drifted like shadows in formation, their weapons primed but silent. Renault stepped onto the command deck. "Give me a full tactical overview." A lieutenant brought up the scan results on the central laser plasma display. The anomaly still lingered above Zaranth IV, unmoving. "Whatever it is," Solmir muttered, studying the readings, "it's aware of us." Renault glanced at the data again. "It hasn't moved since we left the surface." That was what bothered him. If it had been a fleet, it would have maneuvered. If it had been an environmental disturbance, the readings would have fluctuated. This was deliberate. It was waiting. Renault turned to his comms officer. "Has it transmitted anything?" The officer hesitated. "Not in any language we recognize, sir, but—" Renault's gaze sharpened. "But what?" The officer swallowed. "We're picking up a repeating sequence. A low-frequency pulse, barely detectable. It's old, ancient, almost like it's been buried under layers of background radiation for centuries." Renault's gut tightened, a signal waiting to be heard. "Patch it through." The transmission crackled into existence. No words, no symbols, just a deep rhythmic sequence, a pulse of intent. Renault closed his eyes, listening. 3 beats, a pause, 2 beats, a pause, 1, a countdown. His eyes snapped open. "Get me real-time fleet status. Now." Solmir was already moving. The main heads-up display shifted, overlaying fleet positions against the anomaly. The black ships remained in tight formation, but something was wrong. A single vessel, Vanguard 12, was drifting. "They've lost control," one of the officers reported. "I'm getting conflicting data. No damage, no external breaches, but their comms are unresponsive." Renault's jaw clenched. "Override and bring up interior feeds." The display flickered. Inside the Vanguard 12, the corridors were empty. Weapons lay scattered on the floor. Armor plating was peeled open, not torn by explosives, but unmade, as if something had rewritten the molecular structure itself. And the crew? Gone. Not dead, not mutilated, simply absent. Carveth made a low, guttural noise in the back of his throat. "They took them." Renault turned away from the screen, his voice steady. "Seal that ship. No one gets near it." Solmir's fingers tapped against his console. "Orders?" Renault didn't hesitate. "We fall back to the outer ring of the system. Whatever this is, it's not a battlefield we can control. Not yet." The fleet began shifting. black ships peeling away into maneuvering patterns as they prepared to break from the system. But as they did, the anomaly moved, not in a straight line, not in pursuit. It folded inward, collapsing into itself, warping space like an eye blinking shut. And as it disappeared, a final transmission flickered across their displays. A new message, one they could read. We are watching, we are waiting, and now you are known. Silence fell over the bridge. Renault's gaze stayed locked on the screen. Solmir exhaled. I think we just introduced ourselves. Renault nodded. But to what? His fingers curled into a fist. Whatever had been lurking in the dark had just turned its attention to humanity. And Renault intended to find out exactly what was watching. Renault Varros stood motionless in the command chamber of the Erebus, eyes locked on the final transmission glowing across the laser plasma display. We are watching, we are waiting, and now you are known. The words were simple. Director, a statement, not a threat. That was what unsettled him. Threats came from enemies. This question mark, this was an introduction. Solmir exhaled beside him. If that was meant to shake us, it worked. Renault didn't respond immediately. His fingers tapped once against the metal of his gauntlet, calculating. They had spent decades preparing for war, for diplomacy, for subterfuge. Not for this. They don't see us as a threat, Renault murmured. They see us as a curiosity. Solmir's brow furrowed. You think they're testing us? Renault turned, his gaze sharp. They already have. He gestured toward the tactical display. Look at the timeline. The Dominion was nudged into conflict. Their war doctrine was built around outdated intelligence. Intelligence that painted us as weak, complacent. We were baited into revealing our full military capabilities. And the moment we did, he pointed to the anomaly's final movements. They acknowledged us. Silence settled over the bridge. Carveth, arms folded, let out a slow, deliberate exhale. You believe this war was never meant for conquest. It was meant to measure you. Renault nodded once. And now they have an answer. Solmir's fingers curled into his palm. So what do we do? Renault turned back to the display, his expression unreadable. We make sure they measured wrong. The first step was erasing the trail. The Silent Armada had left a scar on the Dominion, but scars could be rewritten. Renault's first order was to control the narrative. Dismantle all active fleet records related to Zoranth IV, he commanded. No Dominion archives, no human records. Any mention of the anomaly is to be scrubbed. His intelligence officers moved swiftly, data vanishing from encrypted servers. What about the Dominion's survivors? Solmir asked. They'll say what we let them say, Renault responded. We craft the story. The Dominion fell due to internal collapse, not external intervention. The war was never about humanity. It was about their own arrogance. Carveth stiffened. You want to rewrite history? I want to buy time. Renault met his gaze. They're watching us now. If they believe we were already at our strongest, they'll come sooner. We need them to think we're weaker than we are. Carveth studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. Clever. The second step was misdirection. Renault ordered a tactical fleet withdrawal, scattering key units to seemingly unrelated regions of space. Make it look disorganized, he instructed, fractured. We let them see us struggle to maintain control. Let them believe we're exhausted. Solmir smirked. And in the meantime, we prepare for the real fight. The black ships disappeared from official records, fading into the dark. On paper, the Silent Armada was fractured. In reality, they were repositioning into the shadows. The third step was creating a scapegoat. We need to give them another war to watch, Renault said. One that isn't ours. He turned to Carveth. What remnants of the Dominion could be weaponized against an unseen enemy? The warlord considered, then his mandibles twitched. The Corthian Pact. They were once our allies, but we betrayed them to secure a foothold in the outer colonies. Would they believe the anomaly was a Dominion experiment gone wrong? Carveth's mandibles flexed. If we give them a reason to... Renault's gaze darkened. Then let's give them one. Using Dominion encryption, they forged false communications, whispers of an abandoned Dominion black site, hidden deep within neutral space, tied to an experiment lost to time. If their watchers needed something to investigate, something to suspect, then Renault would make sure they chased ghosts instead of Earth. The last step was vanishing completely. Renault stood at the viewport of the Erebus, watching as the last Dominion distress signals flickered into oblivion. No transmissions, no new fleet movements, no signals of expansion. His voice was quiet. We go dark. Solmir leaned against the console. And what if they come anyway? Renault's fingers curled against the railing. Then we make sure we are ready. They had spent decades hidden beneath the ice of Europa, beneath the surface of Mars, beneath the shadows of every forgotten battlefield. Now, they would return to the dark. And when their unseen enemy finally decided to move, when they thought they had caught humanity asleep once more, they would learn the truth. Humanity was never sleeping. Renault Varros stood in the dark, not just in the absence of light, but in the kind of darkness that existed before history began, the kind that swallowed empires before they even knew they had been erased. He wasn't afraid of it. He had been raised in the shadow of war, forged in the silence of waiting, and now, for the first time in his life, he felt it waiting back. The laser plasma display before him flickered with ghost signals, phantom echoes of transmissions that didn't exist. The anomaly had vanished. The watchers had gone silent. But silence meant nothing. The weight of their presence remained, pressing down on the edges of known space like an unspoken verdict. Renault knew better than to assume they had lost interest. They had simply moved beyond observation. No new movement? Solmir asked, arms folded. His voice was quiet but laced with something heavier, a thread of expectation, a challenge left unanswered. Renault exhaled slowly, his breath steady. None. Carveth stood near the viewport, eyes locked onto the void beyond the reinforced glass. His kind had ruled an empire once. Now he was watching the weight of something far greater shift in ways he had never imagined. This silence is not mercy, the Dominion officer murmured. It is calculation. Renault's gaze didn't move from the display. Then we make sure they miscalculate. Solmir tilted his head slightly. And how do you propose we do that? Renault finally turned, meeting his admiral's gaze. We let them believe we have done exactly what they wanted, stayed in our place, waited in fear, fallen back into insignificance. He let the words settle before continuing. And then, when they decide it's time, when they think the blade is still at our throats. He leaned forward, voice dropping into something quieter. We remind them who we are. Solmir's lips curled slightly. They think we were sleeping. Renault's expression remained unreadable. They think wrong. The bridge remained still, every officer absorbing the unspoken weight behind the words. This war had never been about conquest. It had been about proving a point, and they had proved it well. Carveth's mandibles twitched as he studied the humans before him. He had been raised to believe his people were superior, that their strength was unchallenged. Now he stood among the true predators of the void. You were never meant to rise, he murmured, yet here you stand. Renault met his gaze. And we are not done standing. Silence stretched between them, heavy with understanding. Then a new signal blinked onto the display. Not a message, not a transmission, a location. Renault's pulse remained steady, but the implications crashed into him with the weight of inevitability. They had left a door open, an invitation. Solmir studied the coordinates, his expression darkening. They're not waiting for us to step through. They want us to see. Renault nodded. Then let's see. The orders went out. The Silent Armada moved. Not in full force, not in open challenge, but in shadows, slipping between known systems like whispers in the dark. They had spent decades hidden beneath ice, beneath dust, beneath history. Now they would hide within the spaces their watchers never expected. Because humanity was not a civilization that waited for permission to exist. They had never been at rest. They had never been asleep. They had been watching right back. And now, they were ready.